Hello. So, welcome to the Researcher Night 2020. And tonight, for one event, 1 hour with the researcher, we are with Ivan Fowler. Hi, Ivan. Welcome.
Hello. Hello.
So Ivan is a storyteller and musician, and he has worked with the Cultural Association Il Mondo di Tales since 2010, and he is the chief writer and researcher of Original History Walk, which is a well-known circuit of educational and entertaining walking tours presenting 19 Italian and English cities. So the Original History Walk covers a range of subjects from history to literature, art and architecture, and science and mathematics. Today, Ivan will help us in understanding the history of the virus, which has changed our lives. So before starting, just let me remind you that it's possible to post questions on the Facebook chat, and we'll pose those questions to Ivan at the end of the talk. So, Ivan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And on behalf of everybody at the Cultural Association Il Mondo di Tales in Pavia, thank you very much to the Notte Europea dei Ricercatori for inviting us to participate. Thank you. So I will be telling you something about the history of coronavirus, the virus that has changed our lives, and viruses and infectious diseases in general. I will do this with this Google form you can see online, which I'm sharing with you. But the link for this form is also in the comments of the Facebook page. So in fact, there are some questions and activities, a bit like a treasure hunt, that you can do on the form. So if you want to, you can follow along, opening the form and answer the questions and do the activities as I speak. So now, if we go down to next, or if your form is in Italian, it will be avanti. We click and we begin our story. And we're now in February of 2020 when coronavirus reached Italy. This is when actually people became aware of the first person to contract the virus in Italy, at least the first person that we know of officially. This was the patient number one, il paziente uno, who was a man from Codogno, and he was submitted to intensive care at San Matteo Hospital in Pavia. And we will talk about San Matteo Hospital again later on. As you can see up the top here from the date, it was the 29th of February. And Mattia, that was his name, he was literally fighting for his life. Well, news spreads very quickly, even faster than a virus in today's world, and it spread across the world. Very soon, everybody knew that Lombardy was in the grip of an epidemic. This is an article from the New York Times, so a major international newspaper. It says, for Italians, dodging coronavirus has become a game of chance. As you can see, it was published on March 11th, 2020. Okay, so it was big news also internationally. Now, as I proceed, you can find these questions and keywords. Okay, so if you want to, you can participate by clicking on the correct keyword. So the question is now, was Mattia, the patient number one, was he the first Italian to get the virus, or was he the first person to catch the virus in Italy itself? When you have decided on the correct answer and you've clicked on it, then you can continue with the Google form to the next part. Okay, so where did this virus come from? Now, as everybody knows, the epidemic itself really started to spread in the Wuhan province in China, although some scientists believe that probably the virus actually originated in humans in another province of China. It just started spreading as an epidemic in the Wuhan province. Now, when I say it originated in humans, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, why do we call it novel coronavirus? Is it really new? Or is it just new to humans? So, scientists believe that this coronavirus, COVID-19, actually made a jump or a vertical leap, they say, from animals to humans. And this occurred somewhere in China. And we're not actually really sure which animal transmitted the virus to people first. So one of the suspects is this gentleman here with his very handsome face and ears. He is a Rufus Horseshoe Bat. Okay, now it's a very big detailed photograph, but that guy is about the size of my thumb. Okay, he's very small. So we have a bat, that's one of the suspects. And if you go down, you can see, there's another suspect. This is an animal called the pangolin. And well, you might think it's a reptile when you look at it, but actually it's a mammal. It's a mammal that has evolved a kind of body armor which has scales all over its body. Pangolin species exist in Africa and across the south of Asia, so including India as well, and also China. Okay, so how could the virus jump from an animal like the pangolin or the bat to people? Well, I'm sure everybody has seen by now this image of what a virus looks like. I mean, really, it's an artistic rendering because you can't really see a virus as such. It's so small. Viruses are really among the tiniest forms of life. Actually, they're so small, and in particular, they are so simple that there is debate whether they are actually living organisms or not. Maybe, some scientists say, yes, they are living. Some scientists say, no, they're not really living organisms. Okay, and I will explain that better very soon. Anyway, let's imagine the virus like a ball. And the outside of the ball is this gray substance. It's mainly made of lipids, okay? It's a fatty substance. That's what the soap destroys. When you wash your hands, okay, the soap is destroying the lipids, holding the ball together. But on the surface of the ball, there are these red spikes. You see those red spikes? And I'm sure many of you have looked at this image on the TV and on internet and thought, well, what are those spikes for? Well, these spikes actually, they're called spike proteins, okay? And they are what allows the virus to enter a cell, okay? The cell of a human being or a bat or a pangolin or another animal. And these spikes allow scientists to try and track the evolution of the coronavirus and see where it comes from originally. So if we go down again, we can see that this is part of a phylogenetic tree that was presented by some Chinese scientists in July 2020. So what do I mean by a phylogenetic tree? Well, really, it's just an elaborate way to say a family tree, okay? So by studying the DNA of many different strains of virus found in many different animals, including people, okay, they're able to make comparisons between the genomes of these different strains of virus and reconstruct how they are related, reconstruct their family tree going backwards, okay? Now, when you look at this diagram, the red lines, okay, they refer to our friend COVID-19. I'm just going to make it a bit bigger so that you can see more easily, okay? There we are. Make it even bigger. You can see that some of these are pangolin. Okay, there's pangolin there. Okay, this one, SARS-CoV-2 Wuhan HU, that means human. This red ball, this is the one that is causing all of the problems around the world right now. There you are. Now, very close is bat-CoV RATG13. This is a strain of coronavirus that lives in bats, infects bats, and is the closest relative to the human coronavirus. Okay, so scientists say, well, the closest relative lives in bats. Maybe the virus jumped from bats to people. Okay, the only problem is that there's not so much contact between people and bats. So how would that happen? It's a bit of a mystery. And then you see it's also very similar to all these other pangolin viruses here. And in particular, if you look at the family tree, you see it's just one fork away. You see that there from a pangolin virus here. Okay. So while this strain in bats shares 96% of DNA, the same, the pangolin strain here shares 92%. So it's actually quite close as well. So let's see if I can move across now and show you the other diagram over here, where we have a kind of graphic representation of what the DNA is telling us. Now, the DNA used for this study is the S gene DNA. That's the DNA which determines the spike, those red spikes on the ball. Remember our friends, the red spikes up there, okay, that help the virus enter human cells? Yeah, so this is a study on the DNA of the DNA controlling these spikes. Okay, so what we see here is that back in the past of the family tree up here, there was a group of coronaviruses living in pangolins. Then some of them over time evolved into the RATG13 virus in bats, which you can see there. Okay, which is the one that is most similar to the SARS-CoV-19 virus in people. There it says SARS-CoV-2. That's just another name for COVID-19. This is the same virus. Now, what the mystery is that there are some connections here. You see these question marks. I'll just zoom in a bit. Can you see those question marks there? Now, those question marks in between the bat and the person, that's the mystery. We still do not know what animals were hosting the virus there when it made this jump from animals to people. And possibly that was a pangolin, or it might have been another animal altogether. We just don't know, okay? So there is more research needed to understand that. Okay, so enough of phylogenetic trees and spikes and DNA. Let's continue with the story. But first, there's another key word for you to indicate. So, which animal did coronavirus live in before arriving to people? And by before, I mean before the final step. So this is the penultimate host. Which animal was the penultimate host? Was it bats or pangolins? When you've selected the correct option there, you can click next, and we'll continue to the next part of the story. Okay, so what we're talking about now is this, this event of a virus, a dangerous virus, jumping from animals to people. Is this something that happens often? Is this something that we should worry about in the future? Well, let's see what the scientists have to say about that. This lady is Ilaria Capua. She's very famous now, an Italian virologist. She's internationally renowned. We will come back to Ilaria Capua at the end of our story because we have something very important to say about her. But for the moment, I just want to focus on something she said early in the epidemic about coronavirus. She said, "We are experiencing an epoch-making phenomenon, a pandemic virus leaving its wild habitat and spreading across the globe in an irresistible wave, invading our lives, our homes, and our loved ones. COVID-19 was born of air traffic, and not only, the megalopolises which invade territory and devastate ecosystems, creating situations of great imbalance in the relationship between people and animals." So Ilaria Capua is talking about a problem of imbalance between people on the one hand and nature and ecosystems on the other, where people ever more numerous with greater and greater populations are invading natural ecosystems. The cities are spreading out, invading the forests, the deserts, and all other ecosystems on Earth. And this creates imbalance in our relationship. Now, it's not just Ilaria Capua saying this. Here is another quote from Maria Naira, who is the Director of Public Health, Environmental and Social Determinants of Health at the United Nations World Health Organization. And she says, biodiversity loss can destabilize ecosystems, promote outbreaks of infectious disease, and undermine development progress, nutrition security, and protection from natural disasters. There are clear links between problems with biodiversity, ecosystem stability, and epidemic infectious diseases such as Ebola virus, and the connection between biodiversity, nutritional diversity, and health. Now, if you're wondering why Dr. Naira is talking about Ebola virus here, this quote is from 2015. Okay, so before coronavirus came onto the scene, there were other viruses, other diseases like Ebola or SARS that were causing problems. And again, they were partly caused by this imbalance between people and nature. So let's take a closer look at this imbalance. What does it mean? Where does it come from? So if you click next and move on, we have to go back many thousands of years, back to when our ancestors were all hunter-gatherers, wherever they lived across the globe, whether they were in Africa or my own Australia, I'm an Australian, or in Europe or in America. They were hunter-gatherers, this lifestyle of hunting animals for food and also gathering plants, berries, roots, and leaf vegetables for nutrition. And we can imagine their settlements something like this reconstruction. Now, what I want you to notice here is that they are very much in a natural setting, okay? So the hunter-gatherers have not yet started impacting a lot on their environment. Actually, hunter-gatherers did impact on the environment. For example, in my native Australia, they impacted very greatly, for example, by using fires, controlled fires, to change the forests. This changed the climate of Australia, made it a very dry country. So hunter-gatherers did have an impact. However, their lives, certainly by comparison with our lives today, their lives were much more natural, and their contact with nature was very functional. You can see here, there are some dead animals that they're using for meat, food, and also for skins to keep warm as clothes. And we can see a dog, a family dog there. And we know, and recent genetic research has confirmed again that dogs were probably the first animal domesticated, and that domestication goes back probably 13, 15,000 years. Some scientists believe even as far back as 33,000 years ago. So we have been sharing our lives with dogs for a very, very long time. If we go down, we see the next stage in our story. We see this wonderful work of art, the Standard of Ur, from Sumer around 3000 BC. So that's what, 5,000 years ago. And it's wonderful in the way it gives us a snapshot of what life was like in the early cities. So now we're talking Mesopotamia in the Middle East, 5,000 years ago. Agriculture is now a big part of life, isn't it? And in fact, you can see there's many people living close together. So these communities are much bigger than the hunter-gatherer communities. And also, we can see that there are a lot more animals and live animals. And it's not that we're just killing the animals for food, but we're now living side by side with the animals. So there's ever closer contact with animals for a lot longer time, giving them food, milking them if they're goats or sheep or cows, riding them if they're horses, obviously doing unpleasant jobs like cleaning the animals and their enclosures, cleaning out the manure, etc. Difficult work, and it means that people were in close quarters with animals for a long time, all their lives, really. That was an ancient city, very small by today's standards. The next step is today's megalopolises. This is a megalopolis for you. And of course, we know the cities in China, but also, for example, Central America or in India, they are great megalopolises. Okay, technology dominates. Most of what you see is technology, but this is a photograph of the center of a city. What we're really interested in here is the outskirts, the outlying parts of the city that are encroaching upon the natural environments, as Ilaria Capua was saying. And in fact, on every continent, you can find places still today where animals and people live in close contact. So this is a livestock market with live animals. In a city, you can see very crowded, many animals and people together in close quarters. Now, to be honest, this is a recent photograph in Asia, but I know that in Pavia, where I live, my adopted city in Italy, there is a piazza called Piazza del Lino, where the livestock market used to be held until just a few decades ago. Okay, so many of my friends in Pavia clearly remember when the cows and the sheep and the other animals were brought right into the center of the city, okay, for the market. So this situation really exists all over the world still today. Okay, now, before we move on to the next page, the key word is which animals were probably the first to be domesticated, dogs or horses? And when you've chosen that, we move on. Next. And we come back to our diagram of a virus. And this is where the title of our history walk comes in, because what is the title? Going viral. The inspiration for this was not just the coronavirus, as you will find out right now. So what's important is when a virus decides to invade a host, it uses these spikes. Now you can see the ball shape again, and you can see the spikes on the outside. It uses these spikes to connect with the outside of the cell, and with receptors on the outside of the cell, they're called, and insert itself into the cell. Now, there are different kinds of virus. Some of them are RNA viruses, some of them are DNA viruses. But what they have in common is that they get inside the host cell and they use the cell to replicate themselves. So what I'm saying is that this ball here, this virus up here, as long as it is outside of the cell, it cannot replicate. it cannot reproduce. It must have a host. It must enter into a host in order to replicate itself. It needs the host for replication. This is why there is a debate among scientists whether a virus is really alive or not. Because if you define a living organism as an organism that is able to reproduce and evolve in its own right by itself, then no, a virus is not alive. Okay, but obviously it is a very organic mechanism. So some scientists say it is life, other scientists say it is not. Anyway, the virus enters into the cell and it tricks the cell into replicating it. And then the new virus that is generated pops out of the cell and goes off looking for another cell to enter and replicate again and again until obviously the virus has invaded all of the host animal. So this is where the inspiration for the title Going Viral came from, because viruses are like spoken words or like internet posts or any information that we create. They too cannot replicate themselves and they cannot spread without the help of a host. So when we tell somebody some information, for example, I tell you, you should wash your hands, yeah, for example, that information is in the form of sound waves. The sound waves travel through the air, they come to your ear, and in just a few moments, in a split second, the sound has died away. The sound is gone. The sound waves have dissipated in the atmosphere, and we cannot hear anything else. The information, however, has gone into your head. Now, if you're a thinking person, you think about the information and you think, do I want to repeat this? Is it good information to repeat? In the case of you should wash your hands, I hope so. You say, right, okay, I will tell other people as well. Okay, everybody, listen up. Listen, everybody, we have to wash our hands. This is where the similarity with viruses come in, because I'm like the host cell. I receive the information. That information cannot replicate itself. It needs a host to replicate it. I consider it, and then I speak. I repeat the information. I have spread it out like a virus. So I don't know, is this why we say going viral when we talk about posts on internet going viral? Because if you think about it, information online as well, it cannot just replicate and spread. It requires people to share it, to click on it and click share, okay, and to send it on. So it's very viral in that sense. We're all familiar with fake news, and I think that no event in history has caused, well, in the history of the internet, which is very short, okay, no event in the history of the internet has caused so much fake news to go viral. And one of my favorite examples were all those animals. Remember the animals that apparently had come back to live in cities and in waterways back in March and April when there was the really serious lockdown in Italy. And I saw photographs of, well, apparently deer walking down the main street of Pavia. I mean, honestly, why would a deer walk down the main street of Pavia? There's no grass to eat. What's it going? Is it looking for clothes? I mean, is it going shopping? What's it doing there? Crazy. Anyway, look. This is one of those images. This was apparently, these were dolphins in the Bay of Naples. Now, look, I've been to Naples. That doesn't look like the Bay of Naples to me. You get suspicious, don't you? What do? Do you click on it and share it, or do you investigate it? But the trouble is, if you want to investigate it, how? Well, probably most of you already know this, but just in case you don't know, what you can do is do a right click on the image and copy the URL, okay? or in Italian, they say copia indirizzo immagine as well. And then you can go to your favorite search engine. For example, it could be Yahoo, it could be Google, whatever you want. And you can go to the search by image function, and it will ask you for an image URL, or you can just drag and drop the image in it. And if you do that, it actually comes up with a list of all the times this image has appeared online. And what you find is that these dolphins actually were swimming in the Potomac River back in 2012. Okay, somebody just found an old photograph of dolphins and said, all right, yes, this will do. And they started posting it saying, dolphins have come back to the Bay of Naples. Okay, ridiculous. The problem is, in order to fight this kind of viral information, you have to stop, you have to think, and you have to investigate. It's a bit of a drag. Anyway, let's continue. So click next. And now we're going to meet our first protagonist from the University of Pavia. Okay, so in telling this story, I decided it would be very nice to focus on the role played in the history of microbiology, but also in the history of epidemiology, so the study of epidemics, by scientists at the University of Pavia. And when I say University of Pavia, in a way, I'm also including in that San Matteo Hospital, because the hospital and the university have had a very close relationship for nearly 500 years. I like to say it's a symbiotic relationship, and very often a professor of medicine at the university is also a doctor at San Matteo Hospital. And that has been the case for like I said, actually more than 500 years, about 570 years now, since the hospital was founded in 1449. So, Lazzaro Spallanzani, he was not from Pavia, he was from Scandiano in the province of Reggio Emilia, but he worked at the University of Pavia for many years, and he founded the Natural History Museum, which you can still visit today. And there's a wonderful statue of him in front of the museum. It's not this statue. Now, I actually chose this statue from his hometown simply because in this statue, you can see the scientist holding up his magnifying glass, can't you? And what is that in his hand? It's a frog. What's he doing with the frog? Well, listen, it's a great story, and you should visit the Natural History Museum of the University of Pavia to find out more about them, okay? But because it's not connected with epidemiology and microbiology, I'm going to skip that story, but it's up to you. Why don't you go and visit Cosmos, the Museum of Natural History, and find out more. Okay, so going down again, we can see a couple of images of the university. We see the historical side. This is the statue of Alessandro Volta, I think the most famous professor in the history of the university. He invented the electrical battery, and with it, the first electrical current. And so this is the historical side. If we go down again, we find the modern side, the Cravino campus. So it's an historical university. It's more than 600 years old, but it also has its modern side. Okay, now, while we're talking about Spallanzani, we're talking about one of the pioneers of experimental research in the field of biology. Okay, so I guess many of you are familiar with a man like Galileo. Galileo was a pioneer of experimental research in the field of physics. So Spallanzani is one of the pioneers in the field of biology, and in particular, microbiology. Now, like every scientist in every age, he had some problems to face. And I think that two of the biggest problems that scientists and researchers face are getting access to information from other scientists, but also access to funds, money. Now, I can tell you that money was not a big problem for Spallanzani, because back in his time, and here we're talking about the late 1700s, 1760s, 1770s, 80s, and 90s. At that time, the University of Pavia received a lot of funding from the imperial family of Austria, and in particular, Maria Theresa of Austria. So basically, Spallanzani and his colleagues like Alessandro Volta, they had unlimited funding for their experiments. Now, when I say this to researchers nowadays, sometimes they just break down and cry, because they can't imagine what it means to have unlimited funding. Funding is such a big problem for science, isn't it? Okay, it wasn't for Spallanzani. He was lucky. He got lots and lots of funding. And in terms of access to information, well, in his day, science was really only communicated either through private letters, and in fact, scientists used to write to each other in private letters, or it was accessible through scientific journals that were published, for example, by academies like the Royal Academy of London, the Prussian Academy of Science, the Academy in Paris, etc. Now, these journals tended to publish in Latin, which was still the lingua franca of science, so that you could write in Latin and scientists in all the other countries could read and understand what you were saying. Okay, we'll come back to both of these points. At the end of our story, we will come back to the question of funding and access to information. Okay. In the meantime, let's continue. And I just want you to select the correct keywords. What are the two main obstacles, two main problems researchers face? And then click next, and we'll continue. So I said Spallanzani was one of the pioneers of experimental biology. So what did he do? Let's take a look at one of his experiments, the one that is relevant to the topic of microbiology, viruses, and infectious diseases. Okay, so back in the time of Spallanzani, scientists had seen through microscopes, they had seen that there were tiny moving objects in liquids, for example. And, they thought, well, if these objects move by themselves, they have to be alive in some way. They must be living organisms, right? So they were trying to understand where these organisms came from. And there was really a very strong tendency to believe a hypothesis called spontaneous generation. So they thought that these living organisms just spontaneously burst into existence, particularly in liquids which contained a lot of organic matter. So a liquid that contains a lot of organic matter is broth. Yeah, the kind of broth I'm sure Spallanzani, from Reggio Emilia, I'm sure he used to have his tortelli every Sunday at lunchtime in broth. So one day he decided to get some of this broth and do a scientific experiment with it. He got the broth in 2 flasks, 2 glass bottles, and he heated both to make them boil. And then he left one of the flasks open and waited some time, and then with his microscope examined what was in the flask, and he saw these microbes, he saw these tiny moving objects in the broth. Then with the other flask, he heated it, he made it boil, but immediately after boiling, he put a stopper in it, so he closed the bottle. It was no longer exposed to the outside air. Then he let some time pass, another 10 minutes. He examined the liquid and he found there were no microorganisms in it. There were no tiny microscopic moving objects. So what conclusions did he draw? He said, okay, these living organisms do not just spontaneously generate in the liquid, not at all. They are in the air outside, and they float into the liquid from the air. So the flask that was closed had no organisms in it. And also, an important conclusion for our story, boiling will kill them. So you boil them, you kill all the organisms. If you don't give it any more contact with the air, the organisms will not come back, okay? Now, unfortunately, for millions of people around the world, sometimes an idea is simply ahead of its time, okay? So Spallanzani did this experimental research in the 1760s, okay? And it took 100 years, 100 years for scientists to come back to these experiments and understand them, and above all, understand their implications for epidemiology, for controlling disease. So I've got this wonderful image here of a Leonardo da Vinci flying machine, because it's true, sometimes an idea is just ahead of its time. The rest of the world is just not ready for it, like a flying machine in Renaissance Italy, or like Spallanzani's experiments. Okay, now the key word here. What language did scientists use to write articles in journals back at the time of Spallanzani in the late 1700s? Was it Latin or was it French? Obviously, to date, scientists use English. Now, you can click next when you have selected your answer, and then we continue our story. And we're going to continue our story with these little insects here. Now, if you enjoy a challenge, I will give you a little bit of time now to repeat what I told you before. Remember, I told you you can find out what an image is by searching for that image, clicking on the URL, right click, select the URL, or choose, drag and drop the image and search by image in your favorite search engine. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of time to find out just what these insects are, and then I'll tell you. Okay, so the next question is, in 1835, an Italian naturalist published some very important research on a disease that killed these insects. What was his name? So his name was Agostino Bassi. Agostino Bassi, and he was from Lodi, and he was a student at the University of Pavia, a student of Lazzaro Spallanzani's. So we have the next generation of scientists from Spallanzani. So as a young man, he studied with the great Spallanzani. Probably he was very influenced by Spallanzani's ideas, and then he became an agricultural scientist. And at this time, across Lombardy and the Veneto region and Piedmont, across the north of Italy, a disease, a mysterious disease, was killing these insects. So you've had a bit of time now to find out what they are. So I'll tell you the correct answer. These insects are silkworms. Okay, silkworms. They are the caterpillars, the larvae of the silk moth. Now, what's special about them is that they produce a kind of thread, a kind of silk thread, which we use for making clothes. Okay, so back at the time of Agostino Bassi, silk was a big industry in Lombardy and in the Veneto and in also Piedmont. So it was really important economically. Okay, it was a big business, and a disease was killing the silkworms. So it was very urgent for scientists to find out what was causing the disease and find a way to stop it. Well, it was Agostino Bassi who discovered that this disease, it was called muscardine, he discovered it was a fungus. It was a microscopic fungus, and he discovered that it was spreading from silkworm to silkworm. Okay, so he understood that the agent of contagion was a microbe, a microorganism. That was 1835. Now, at this point, he had still only made this observation for the silkworm, okay? But nearly 10 years later, he repeated the observation and extended it to other animals and even people. Okay, so in 1844, he published a paper saying maybe microbes are responsible for infection also in other animals and also in people. Okay, that was in 1844. The story's not over yet, okay, but he was making some great progress here. So there's another question for you. What was the relationship between Agostino Bassi and Spallanzani? How were they connected? And also, can anybody find out, this is a research challenge now, what the correct word in English is for the cultivation of the insects in the picture? Okay, so when you are ready, you can click on next and continue. We'll continue with the story. Okay. Now, here's another activity that you can do in your homes. You can also find a particular kind of object. So at this point, you can get up, stretch your legs, and take a look around your house. I want you to find an object that is made of silk. Okay. I'm sure that you can find something. Okay. So I will give you just a few seconds to do that. Get up, stretch your legs. I think we've been talking for a while now, so it's nice to have a quick break, okay? Before we continue our story with a little stroll down the main street of Pavia. Okay, so this is Stradenwava. If you've visited Pavia ever, I'm sure that you've seen Stradenwava. On the right-hand side over here, you can see the historical university building. And if you go down Stradenwava, you arrive at the River Ticino, a wonderful river. And along the River Ticino, you will find quite a large number of these trees. This is the mulberry tree. They're all over Lombardy. They're all over the north of Italy, and also in the south to an extent. The reason for this is that the silkworm loves eating mulberry leaves. And it's a win-win situation because, you know, the silkworm eats the leaves and we eat these wonderful red berries. Better than that? Okay, so this story is also part of our landscape. It has actually changed the way our landscape is. So the key word is now, what part of the tree do the silkworms eat while they're thriving and producing silk? Then you can click on next and continue. And now our story moves on to 1854. And now we're going to move to London, which in 1854 was the richest and most powerful city in the world. Okay. It was very different to London today. As you can see from this illustration from a newspaper at the time, it was very dirty, very crowded. Sanitary conditions were not good back then for London. And in 1854, there was an outbreak of cholera disease. And you can see this illustration has a title here, A Court for King Cholera. This is an illustration of a street in London at the time. You can see the little children playing in the dirt and in the filth, all the people crowded together, very, very poor hygienic conditions. Now, the protagonist of this part of our story is a man called John Snow, No, not that Jon Snow. I know he's more famous today. No, forget him. Not him. Yes, this is our Jon Snow. This is our protagonist. Much more serious. A right English gentleman, isn't he? So Mr. Jon Snow, Dr. Jon Snow, well, he discovered the means by which cholera was spreading in this epidemic. Okay, so what he did was he created an infographic. Okay, so a graphic designed to convey information. In this case, it was information he collected through his research. Now, this is a map of the portion of London where the outbreak of cholera was. I'm going to zoom in on that for you. There you are. Now, all these black squares represent houses where people got sick with cholera. Okay, so these are the houses. And what he did was he mapped out where people were feeling sick. And he said, okay, probably the origin of the epidemic is at the center of that area, at the heart of the area affected. So we had to map out the epidemic to see what the center was. And so he discovered it was this street here. You can see Broad Street. And at the center of Broad Street, it's a bit difficult to read on the map. There is a pump. It's a water pump. Okay. So what was happening was there was no running water in people's houses. So in order to get their water for cooking, bathing, unfortunately even drinking, the people had to go down into the street and go to these public pumps. Now, did I mention there was no running water in houses? Well, that also causes a problem for sewerage, doesn't it? For getting rid of feces and urine. In fact, some people used to just dig holes under their houses and fill them up with sewerage and then close them again, what we call a septic pit in English. Now, some genius had dug a septic pit next to the water pump. And of course, sewerage was infiltrating the water supply from the septic pit. So that pump became infected. And the handle of the pump in particular, so people were using the handle of the pump like this, an old-fashioned pump to bring the water up. And every time they touched the handle, they would get infected, and the water itself was infectious. And it was Jon Snow who identified this as the cause. So Jon Snow is really one of the early epidemiologists. So epidemiology is the study of epidemics and what causes them. All right, so now if you want to, you can write down your answer. What object was the focal point, the epicenter of the cholera outbreak? Then you click next and we continue with another interesting discovery that Jon Snow made. He discovered that workers in a brewery nearby were not affected by the cholera. So why was that? So imagine that you work in a beer brewery back in London in 1854. Probably you're not very educated. You really don't have any reason to not drink large quantities of beer. I mean, why would you not? You work in a brewery, you have easy access to beer. Probably it's cheap because you're a worker. Why not just drink it? In fact, the workers at the brewery weren't drinking water. They were drinking just beer all the time, and they didn't get sick. The beer was not infecting them. And obviously, Jon Snow was interested in this, and he investigated it, and he found that the brewing process, this is a wonderful map of the brewing process, okay, was killing the cholera bacteria. So what was happening here? Well, when you look at the map of the brewing process, you can see wort boiling here. Wort is, well, it's really just an Old English word for plant. Okay, it refers to the malt that's being processed. And at a certain point, it gets boiled. Of course, the boiling will kill the bacteria, kill the microbes, right? Now, you're thinking, just a moment, didn't Spallanzani already know that in the 1760s, nearly 100 years before? Yeah, he did. But remember, Spallanzani's research was ahead of its time. Other scientists were not ready yet to understand it and understand its implications. So nearly 100 years later, we still have a scientist like Dr. John Snow, a very intelligent man. He does not know about Spallanzani's research. So for him, this is quite new. The other thing in the process, very close to the wort boiling, you can find fermentation. Of course, also the fermentation and the alcohol is killing the microbes. Okay, so now you can select here which parts of the brewing process was making the beer safe to drink. Fortunately for the brewery workers who, you know, could drink beer all the time and not get sick. And then we click on next and we continue. And now finally, we come to the point where all of this information from Spallanzani to Agostino Bassi to Dr. John Snow, it all comes together. And when I say Spallanzani, Agostino Bassi, Dr. John Snow, they're just three. But in reality, there were hundreds, thousands of scientists across Europe and across other countries like the United States of America who all contributed something to this story. They all contributed knowledge. They all contributed research, okay? I have just selected a few people to tell the story, but, you know, they're just the tip of the iceberg, as we say. Really, this research would not have been possible without all those hundreds of thousands of people across generations who patiently, over a lot of time, through a lot of effort, carried out research. Okay, so I'm just talking about the tip of the iceberg. And the real hero of the story who brings all of this information together is, of course, the great French scientist Louis Pasteur, whose name has also become a verb, pasteurize, okay, to use high temperatures to protect foodstuffs like milk, for example, from breeding microbes. Well, what happened? Pasteur put two and two together. He found the old literature on Spallanzani's experiments and he repeated them. He also looked at Agostino Bassi's papers. He looked at all of the information coming from all of the scientists in the intervening generations. He put it all together and he basically created the modern science of hygiene through pasteurization, attention to the preservation of food, microbes as the agent of infection, etc., etc. This was the 1860s, exactly 100 years after Spallanzani. So now the rate of research increased very rapidly, and many other great scientists following Pasteur were able to isolate and identify agents of infection, okay? Other fungi, bacteria, and then eventually also viruses around the year 1898. So the next question is to answer: how many scientists' contributions were necessary to develop from Spallanzani to Pasteur? Okay, are we talking generations? Are we talking just French and Italian scientists, just a handful of people, or thousands of scientists all over the world? If you click next, this brings us back to Miss Ilaria Capua. remember we talked about Ilaria Capua back at the beginning of the story, and we also mentioned some obstacles to research. Obstacles to research being access to information, which was limited to scientific journals and only written in Latin once upon a time. Very few people had access to that information. And the other big obstacle was funding, access to money to continue research. Well, you know, Ilaria Capua back in 2006 was at the center of a scandal. Okay, this is an article from the Wall Street Journal. So again, a very important international newspaper. And basically it's saying she was a rebel scientist. What's going on? What's happening? Well, Ilaria Capua was working with populations in Africa, investigating the emergence of bird flu viruses. So bird flu is an influenza virus or influenza viruses, sorry, there are many, that jump from birds, in particular poultry like chickens and ducks and geese, to people, okay? So she was investigating these diseases that were emerging in Africa, and she wanted to make her data, the data from her observations, accessible to other virologists and people in the, and also people working in government and the field of health. And at that time, still in 2006, it was not the done thing. So really, you only published your data. If you were a serious scientist, you only published your data in academic journals which were not accessible to everybody. The academic journals were accessible to universities, hospitals, but not to everybody. And Ilaria Capua said, no, no, no way. This information is so important, is so vital, because we're talking about a potential epidemic. We must make it available to everybody. So she started to publish her data on open access internet sites. It caused a scandal. She was not the only one. She was with colleagues who were doing exactly the same thing, who thought exactly the same things. In the face of the movement, let's say, but she was not the only one. And when the scandal died down, basically, it was recognized that, in fact, open access for information like epidemics, viruses, is really absolutely necessary. It's fundamental. That information must be available to everybody. And so today it's quite normal for scientists to publish data, raw data, on open access sites. Scientific journals still have a very important role because they're like a filter. They select and filter and help perfect the most important sides of research. But open access makes the data that the research is based on available to everybody. Okay, fundamental. And right now, just over the last few days, people have been talking about, well, where is the experimental data from the new vaccines being developed for coronavirus? And quite naturally, quite rightly, they're saying, we want to see that data, you know, not because vaccines are bad, not because vaccines are a potential risk, but because that's what scientists do. They look at the data and they make conclusions based on that, okay? So access to information, that was only one of two obstacles that we talked about. The other one is money. That's maybe more tricky. What do you think? Well, even in the case of funding, maybe internet can help out again. So open access on internet can help people get information. Internet has also created the phenomenon of crowdfunding. And the University of Pavia was one of the first, maybe the first university to actually create its own institutional crowdfunding activity called Universitiamo, okay, by the University of Pavia. I love the name because Universitiamo in Italian, it's kind of a play on words. It's kind of a pun. It's like saying university, I love you, but at the same time, it's like saying, let's university together. It's a great name. And this crowdfunding platform has now helped quite a number of young researchers at the University of Pavia continue their research, pay, for example, for a researcher's salary for a year, or pay for new machines and instruments that they need, or pay for sampling to be carried out. Okay, crowdfunding is potentially the future of scientific funding. It's very democratic. You know, we don't need politicians to wake up and realize that science is important anymore. We can do it for ourselves. We can make it happen ourselves. In an ideal world, politicians would realize how important science is. But we know it's not an ideal world. We know that politicians can be, not necessarily are, but can be very short-sighted. We know that they're happy to give funding to research into coronavirus now because it's a huge problem. But what about next year? What about the year after? Will they still be happy to give all that money to research? Will they give money to research only if they think it's a potential economic problem, or will they continue to give money to research because research is important, because it is? Well, you know what? We don't need you politicians. We can do it ourselves with crowdfunding. It's becoming more and more common, more and more popular. And actually, it can be great fun. The teams at the University of Pavia have organized rock and roll concerts. They've organized dinners and fundraising events and all sorts of things. Crowdfunding can be great fun, okay? And I think it may well be the future of funding for science. So here you are. What is the correct definition of open access? And when you've selected that, click next, and we have come to the end of our walk. So I will leave you here with something that Louis Pasteur said, which I think is the real message behind this. Science knows no country, because knowledge belongs to humanity and is the torch which illuminates the world. So there must be no barriers to knowledge. It belongs to everybody. And with that, thank you very much for following. If you're interested in receiving our Original History Walks newsletter, please, you can write your email address and we will be happy to include you in our newsletter. So at the end of the form, you can click submit and send us your email address and we'll get in touch with you. We'll put you on the mailing list, okay? So once again, thank you very much to the Notte Europea dei Ricercatori. And now if there are any questions. So Gabriella, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi there.
Yeah. So
I'm a bit scared of the questions, Gabriella, because I hope I can answer.
For sure you can. So unfortunately, I don't see any on Facebook, but I have some that I can ask you actually directly. So which could be interesting for our follower as well.
Okay.
So how do you think that the coronavirus does compare with other historical epidemics that happens in the past?
Okay. Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the original history walks have for many years now done history walks. I mean, not virtual history walks, but actual physical walk around the city history walks in Milan about the Black Death and about Manzoni and the story of the plague, the bacteria Yersinia pestis in Milan, starting with the great pandemic of 1347 to 1352. So that's the one that Giovanni Boccaccio wrote about in his Decameron. And then continuing with successive waves of the plague, which hit Milan, including the other famous one, which Alessandro Manzoni wrote about in his book, I Promessi Sposi. Certainly, I think there's no doubt that other epidemics in the past have caused a lot more damage and a lot more death and a lot more suffering. There's no doubt. I don't think coronavirus can really compare with them from that point of view. Where it does compare, I think, is in the overall effect it's having on our society, because our society has reacted in a way it never reacted in the past, and it decided that human life is not something we can just throw away. It has to be protected at all costs, and so even at enormous economic cost, it said, no, we're going to stop this virus. We're going to do whatever we can to stop it. And that's the first time in history it's happened. Maybe just because it's the first time in history it's been possible. I don't think any government before modern governments could have done what they did in China, for example, what we've done in Italy here. They didn't have the knowledge the scientific knowledge to do that. Even the logistic capability. You know, in China, they told people to lock down. They couldn't even go shopping. They brought them food door to door. But I mean, the whole population, the logistics of that is phenomenal. I don't think that was even possible before the present century. So from that point of view, I think it's having an impact that no other epidemic has had before, for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. Also, I mean, the situation we have now allows the government to react to give.
We have the capability of reacting in this way that people in the past did not have, and we can coordinate between countries as well, because at the time of the Black Death in medieval times, you couldn't coordinate a response across all of Europe. That was impossible. Okay, the communications were not that good, and relationships between countries did not allow it. We have the European Union, which allows us to coordinate our response. That didn't exist.
But in the past, the pandemics has generated social changes that do that, right? And do you think coronavirus will do?
So lasting change, I think, is another question. And of course, nobody knows. You would need a crystal ball to see into the future. Going back to the Black Death, the Great Pandemic of 1347 to 1352, the effect of that was to actually cause an incredible lack of labor in the market. So many young people as well had been killed by the bacterium that basically there were not enough people to work. So laborers, simple workers, were able to actually, raise their fee. They were saying, well, if you want me to do your work, to till your fields, to bring in your harvest, you'd better pay me more. And if we look at what happened towards a generation after that, towards the end of the 1300s, there were a number of rebellions in the working classes across Europe, because for the first time, I think, the really low-class people, the serfs, the farmers, the peasants, started to feel, hey, we can be important too. We can command our higher salaries. And this brought about, I think, some lasting social change, okay? Maybe not as much as people think. I think more than social change, it caused psychological trauma. Europe and I think all of Asia was psychologically traumatized by the Black Death. It's been a part of our art and our literature and our popular imagination ever since. Mm-hmm. So coming back to coronavirus, what lasting social change could happen? Well, I wonder if it will create a culture of distance. I hope not. I hope we'll be able to go back to being as sociable as we were before. But it might. Previous experiences with epidemics, for example, convinced people of the need of basic hygiene. before the 1850s, people didn't wash their hands. Even before the Spanish flu in 1918 and 19, people didn't wash. Why would you wash your hands? What's that for? What's the point? So, people didn't wash their hands, and then they did. And now we really do.
Right.
So that is a lasting change. It's a simple thing. What if the same thing happens for social distancing? And what if we create a culture of distance that wasn't there before? The great science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, in one of his books called Naked Sun, he imagined a planet where people were disgusted by the idea of physical contact, and people would live as far apart as possible. Right. It was kind of like an enormous Australia where everybody's got a house with an enormous garden, and they just never come into physical contact. Okay, we do have physical contact in Australia, but I think it's the only country where people have, so much space. He imagined an extreme version of that, and it's interesting, in his imagination, the only people who still had physical contact were small children. And we can see today that the only people who are still allowed to go to school are the small children, thankfully. Okay.
Right.
So I don't know, maybe we could take a step in that direction, but I hope not. And of course, only time will tell. Who can say for the future? Yeah.
Honestly, I hope not as well, so we can back to hug each other.
At
least it's part of Italian culture,
Absolutely. I mean, if I came from Australia to Italy, it was because I did not want social distancing. I wanted the warmth of the social culture here. If I want distance, I can go back to Australia.
You have much space.
Yeah, all the space you need.
All right. All right. So thank you very much for this really nice journey. It was a really interesting walk in the past, in the development of these viruses, and it was really interesting. And so people can find back this video on Facebook and on our site as well.
Okay.
So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.